India stands at a pivotal moment in its quest for global influence, yet recent events reveal a troubling gap between aspiration and reality. The recent developments in India's foreign policy landscape present a complex picture that demands careful examination, particularly in light of the aftermath of the Galwan incident and India's participation in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization (SCO) summit. What emerges from a thorough analysis is a troubling pattern of diplomatic setbacks that raise fundamental questions about India's ability to advance its strategic interests on the global stage. The SCO Defense Ministers meeting, hosted by China and attended by Pakistan, Russia, and several Central Asian nations, served as a crucial litmus test for India's diplomatic influence. Yet the outcomes revealed significant challenges in translating our geopolitical aspirations into tangible international support. When India's Defense Minister Rajnath Singh sought to include references to the Galwan incident and Pakistan-sponsored terrorism in the joint declaration, specifically highlighting the targeted killings of Hindus, the proposal met with resounding silence from fellow member states. This collective refusal to acknowledge India's legitimate security concerns, culminating in India's decision to abstain from signing the final declaration, exposes the limitations of our diplomatic capital within multilateral forums. The complete absence of support from even traditionally friendly nations like Russia, despite our substantial defense and energy partnerships, points to deeper structural issues in how India builds and maintains international alliances. This diplomatic isolation becomes even more concerning when we consider that China's overt backing of Pakistan effectively neutralized any potential sympathy for India's position among other SCO members. It's a stark reminder that even in forums where India expects influence, its voice is being sidelined. The situation grows increasingly perplexing when examining External Affairs Minister S. Jaishankar's subsequent visit to Russia, where attempts to secure Russian support for designating Pakistan as a terrorist state or recognizing the Galwan incident as an act of terrorism yielded disappointing results. Moscow's reluctance is particularly striking given Russia's economic dependence on Indian arms purchases and oil imports, especially amid Western sanctions following the Ukraine conflict. This paradox, where even nations with substantial economic incentives to support India refrain from doing so on critical security issues, suggests fundamental flaws in our diplomatic strategy and alliance management. The contrast becomes starker when we recall Russia's recent nomination of Pakistan for a UN vice chair position, signaling a clear realignment that India appears powerless to prevent. This shift underscores a painful reality. India's long-standing partnerships are not translating into the support we need when it matters most. America's evolving position presents another layer of complexity in India's diplomatic challenges. Despite Pakistan's army chief openly supporting internationally recognized terrorist organizations like Lashkar-e-Taiba and Jaish-e-Mohammed, even going so far as to publicly attend funeral prayers for slain terrorists, the United States has progressively softened its stance toward Pakistan. The recent G7 summit highlighted this shift dramatically, where Indian journalists faced unprecedented exclusion from coverage, while participating nations conspicuously avoided any mention of Pakistan's sponsorship of terrorism or its role in the Galwan conflict. This represents a complete reversal from previous international positions and underscores the erosion of India's ability to shape global narratives about cross-border terrorism. The US's pivot toward Pakistan, despite its overt ties to terrorism, signals a troubling trend where India's concerns are being sidelined in favor of geopolitical expediency. Prime Minister Modi's much-publicized global engagements and high-profile diplomacy appear increasingly disconnected from tangible outcomes when tested on substantive security issues, where Pakistan's military leadership now receives red carpet treatment internationally. India finds its core concerns about terrorism systematically marginalized in global forums. The Biden administration's repeated claims about mediating between India and Pakistan, despite New Delhi's consistent denials of any such diplomatic engagement, further compounds these challenges. More troubling is the Indian government's muted response when American officials make factually incorrect statements about India-Pakistan relations, raising questions about our diplomatic assertiveness and capacity to correct misleading narratives. This lack of pushback risks allowing false narratives to take root, further eroding India's global standing. The core issue transcends individual incidents and points to systemic weaknesses in India's foreign policy apparatus. Despite ambitious self-projection as a global leader and Vishwaguru, India finds itself alarmingly isolated on matters that directly impact its national security. China's strategic coercion has compelled even traditional allies like the United States to rehabilitate Pakistan's international standing, while Russia and European nations follow this lead with little regard for India's concerns. This isolation becomes more pronounced when examining the international media landscape, where persistent negative portrayals of India go largely unchallenged by effective counter-narratives from Indian diplomatic channels. The failure to shape global perceptions allows adversaries to dominate the narrative, leaving India on the defensive. What emerges from this comprehensive analysis is what can only be described as a diplomatic debacle of significant proportions. When not a single nation, including traditional partners like France beyond the narrow context of the Rafale deal, stands with India on designating Pakistan as a terrorist state, we must confront uncomfortable truths about the limitations of our foreign policy. The harsh reality is that India's extensive diplomatic outreach, despite numerous high-profile visits and summit participations, has failed to translate into concrete international support on our most pressing security concerns. This disconnect between diplomatic activity and substantive outcomes reveals fundamental flaws in how India builds alliances, articulates its positions, and leverages its growing economic and military heft in global forums. It's a sobering moment that demands introspection about why our efforts are falling short. The fundamental question demanding urgent attention is why India's position finds such limited international resonance despite our undeniable economic and strategic importance. Is this failure attributable to inadequate diplomatic representation in key capitals, an inability to build substantive issue-based alliances, or ineffective communication of our security concerns? The evidence suggests a combination of these factors has created a perfect storm where India remains dangerously isolated on terrorism-related issues that directly impact our national security. The recent sequence of events, from the SCO snub to Russia's reluctance and America's ambivalence, reveals that India's diplomatic machinery requires comprehensive reassessment and revitalization. Without addressing these gaps, India risks being seen as a paper tiger, a nation with immense potential but limited influence where it counts. This isolation isn't merely about Pakistan. It reflects deeper structural shortcomings in how India projects power and builds sustainable partnerships in an increasingly complex and contested global order. The path forward demands honest introspection about why our diplomatic efforts yield such limited results where it matters most. Without addressing these systemic issues through strategic vision, professional diplomatic core development, and more effective alliance-building strategies, India risks becoming an economic and military power that nevertheless lacks meaningful international support on critical security challenges. The Galwan aftermath and SCO experience should serve as wake-up calls, prompting a fundamental reimagining of India's diplomatic strategy, messaging, and implementation to prevent further erosion of our international standing on issues central to our national security. To deepen our understanding, let's consider the broader context of India's global aspirations. India's rise as an economic powerhouse, with a GDP surpassing $3 trillion and a burgeoning tech sector, has positioned it as a potential global leader. Yet, economic might alone isn't enough to secure influence in a world driven by strategic alliances and power politics. The SCO summit exposed how China's growing clout allows it to rally support against India, even in forums where we expect leverage. For instance, Central Asian nations, which rely on India for trade and investment, remain silent on our concerns, likely swayed by China's economic dominance through initiatives like the Belt and Road. This highlights the need for India to counter China's influence with more robust economic diplomacy. Another critical factor is the human cost of this isolation. The Galwan incident, where Indian soldiers lost their lives, remains a raw wound for the nation. The failure to secure international acknowledgement of this tragedy fuels anger among Indian citizens and could lead to domestic unrest, further complicating India's diplomatic efforts. The lack of global support for India's stance on terrorism not only weakens its strategic position, but also risks emboldening adversaries like Pakistan, who may perceive India's isolation as an opportunity to escalate tensions. To stretch this discussion to meet the 12-minute mark, let's explore the domestic implications. The Indian public's growing frustration with perceived diplomatic failures could pressure the government to adopt a more aggressive stance, potentially escalating regional tensions. For example, recent social media trends show a surge in nationalist sentiment, with hashtags calling for stronger action against Pakistan gaining traction. This public pressure could limit the government's flexibility in pursuing nuanced diplomacy, pushing it toward harder lines that may further alienate allies. The path forward requires India to rethink its approach to multilateral forums. Engaging more proactively in platforms like the Quad, alongside the US, Japan, and Australia, could counterbalance China's influence in the SCO. Investing in a stronger public diplomacy campaign to shape global media narratives is also crucial. India must amplify its voice through international media partnerships and digital platforms to challenge negative portrayals and build support for its security concerns. As we reflect on these challenges, the urgency for reform is clear. India stands at a crossroads, with its global aspirations at stake. The Galwan aftermath and SCO debacle are not just setbacks, but opportunities to rebuild a more effective diplomatic strategy. In my next video, we'll explore how India can forge stronger alliances and reclaim its voice on the world stage. For now, let's recognize the need for bold strategic change to ensure India's security and stature are no longer sidelined.